Welcome to No Rares Required, Episode 19, Rakdos Removal. Every week I discuss a drafting strategy for a different archetype, and today I will be covering my strategy for drafting Rakdos, or Black-Red, in Phyrexia All Will Be One. It is the second least drafted archetype, followed shortly within 500 games or so by Simic, which should mean you can draft it consistently as it will be open most of the time and you won't be contested. However, I've found Rakdos to be in kind of a tricky spot, and most of its power comes from uncommons, which makes the archetype difficult to draft even when you are the only Rakdos player at the table. However, I do think it is a decent archetype when the stars align, and have managed to get it to work with just commons and uncommons. The archetype is labeled as Oil Counters and Sacrifice on MTG Arena, which I think is very misleading since it has very little oil or sacrifice synergies outside of the signpost uncommon Charforger. It does have a below average win rate on 17 lands, which means people are being misled somewhere, so maybe that is why. I found Rakdos to be more about trading the board, keeping the board state small, and drafting plenty of removal. My Tier 1 top common is Chimney Rabble, essentially a 4/4 for 4, where 3/3 of it has haste. It has performed well in this set, and is in my top 3 commons for every red archetype. Now that I think about it, I bet it's my most drafted common. The biggest part of this card is that it changes the tempo if you are in a race. It allows you to immediately attack because of haste, while also leaving behind a 1/1 that can chump block or trade. It's cards like this that lower the difference in win rate between being on the play, or going first, versus the draw, or going second. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I've pack one, picked one Chimney Rabble, and I have no regrets. I've played 7 in a deck. I love it. And it goes reasonably late. You can pick these up around pick 6 or even 7. My first Tier 2 common is Hexgold Slash. It's hard to say if this is the best removal in red, or if that title belongs to Rebel Salvo, but what I can say with confidence is it is the best common red removal. And there are a fair amount of viable combat tricks in the set, like Complete Devotion in white, Titanic Growth in green, Offer Immortality in black, Free from Flesh and Blazing Crescendo in red, so this can easily get a 2-for-1. It also deals 4 damage to creatures with Toxic, so it can trade way up in value. However, it gets taken around pick 3 or pick 4, so you'll want to take it pretty early. My last Tier 2 common is Barbed Batterfist. You may notice something. All red cards. Similar to Izzet, I don't usually aim to start out as Rakdos, but instead pivot into it from either a red-heavy Boros or Gruul start, and I do find myself being mostly red most of the time. I really like Barbed Batterfist even without other 4 Mirrodin synergies. In Rakdos, you're interested in trading and trading often. A 3/1 for 2 trades very well, and if the board is empty from all your removal, it hits well for a 2-drop. It gets picked up around pick 5 or 6, so you don't even need to go out of your way to get these, and I'll run as many as I can. Now for Tier 3. Anoint with Affliction. Yes, at Tier 3. You have so much removal in Rakdos, and unlike every other black archetype, you don't have much access to poison or reason to include poison, so you won't get your opponent corrupted, and so this card plays more as a smother that exiles. Anoint's worst archetype is Rakdos, but it's still better than filler, since it is removal at the end of the day. It goes by turn 3 or 4, so you'll need to take it early, and I also think you should aim to have at least 6 pieces of removal, ideally even 7 or 8. My last Tier 3 common is Testament Bearer. That's only 5 commons above filler, which is why I think it feels like Rakdos isn't open when it is the second least drafted archetype. Most of its power is in the uncommons. Similar to Barbed Batterfist, it applies a lot of pressure when the board is empty, and it trades well, especially since it digs for a card when it dies. I'd much rather run Chimney Rabble, but this card goes late, and you can pick it up on the wheel. Now for the uncommons. My first tier 1 uncommon is Ambulatory Edifice. Removal is important in this archetype, and this creature has removal built into it. The -1/-1 gets around indestructible counters on Bladed Ambassador, and I've said it before and I'll say it again, there are 25 creatures with 1 HP in this set, so this card can easily get a 2-for-1. Worst case, it can ping a Might or something left at 1 HP after combat. My last tier 1 uncommon is the Signpost Charforger. This card goes late for an uncommon, like really late. You can pick these up around pick 7 or 8, and is a great signal to use that Rakdos is in fact open. This is the card that I think misleads people in Rakdos because it is the only card I recommend that gets payoffs for doing the oil counter and sacrifice thing. However, its payoffs come from trading and trading often. If you follow my tips, you'll often find that the game becomes very small. It's not uncommon for the board to have 1 or 2 creatures and both players to have no cards in hand. That's why I'm higher on cards like Testament Bearer than I am in other archetypes. And this card helps you outdraw your opponent as well. This card is important for the archetype, just not because of oil or sacrifice synergies. My tier 2 uncommon is Sheoldred's Edict. The upside to trading often and keeping the board small is that edicts become very good removal. In Orzhov, I put this at tier 3 because I felt Vraska's Fall was a decent option, but without caring much about poison counters, I've moved Sheoldred's Edict to tier 2 since you can make your opponent sacrifice a non-token creature when there is a token creature on the board, where Vraska's Fall can't. And as a bonus, Sheoldred's Edict can hit Planeswalkers. Sheoldred's Edict is also, its best archetype is Rakdos, and I recommend taking as many as you are offered. My next tier 2 uncommon is Rebel Salvo. Arguably the best removal in red, this removes almost every target in the set at instant speed. It also gets cheaper for each equipment and is a nice payoff for picking up Barbed Batterfist as your common 2-drop. I think you can be pretty spewy with your removal in Rakdos if you grabbed ample amounts of removal, but you might want to save this one for the perfect time. Try to think of what targets your opponent might be playing that could win them the game. Since Anoint with Affliction won't have Corrupted, this is your best spot removal for the biggest threats. As top quality uncommon removal, it gets picked up as early as pick 2 or 3, so you'll want to grab it when you see it. My next tier 1 uncommon is Furnace Punisher. An excellent payoff for trading and keeping the board small is that it becomes very difficult for your opponent to block creatures with Menace. People aren't playing the Sphere lands as much as they were at the beginning of the set, but if you happen to be on the play and your opponent starts with a turn 1 Sphere land to play around the fact that it comes into play tapped, I've managed to hit my opponent for 2 a couple of times. Definitely not the norm, but exciting enough when it happens. These go pretty late for an uncommon, around pick 5 or 6. Excuse me. My last tier 2 uncommon is Resistance Skywarden. Like Furnace Punisher, it also has Menace and can be difficult to block. I prefer these to Furnace Striders, the 4/5 with oil counters that can give haste for 5 mana, since you don't have many late game threats above 5 converted mana cost, or CMC. Like Furnace Punisher, this card is best in Rakdos, where the Menace gets the biggest payoff. This also goes late for an uncommon, around pick 5 or 6. Now for my tier 3 uncommons. Drown in Ichor is a tier S mythic level uncommon in Orzhov and Dimir, where you really benefit off of the Proliferate in a toxic strategy. You care less about the Proliferate in Rakdos and have so many removal options, it's a little less important. You still want all of the removal, but this goes early, so you'll have to take it around pick 2 or 3. My next tier 3 uncommon is Bilious Skull-Dweller, also a rock star in Orzhov and Dimir, for getting those early poison counters. but you don't care too much about it in Rakdos. But when it comes for trading 1-for-1, there isn't a better 1-drop. The Death Touch is key. Also, your options for 1 and 2 cost creatures is somewhat limited in Rakdos. You still want to play around 6 1 or 2 cost creatures, since developing the board is so important in this set. It's tempting to plan on using early removal, but cards like Crawling Chorus are really punishing to that plan. This card also goes early, so you'll have to take it around pick 3 or 4. Now for my last tier 3 uncommon, Cacophony Scamp. This card can do some silly things in Gruul because of combat tricks like Titanic Growth, and Boros because of equipment. But I've really liked it in Rakdos because it trades well. If your opponent has 2 1 HP creatures, then this is a 2-for-1. It also goes super late for an uncommon, around pick 6 or 7, and is a great option to fill out the lower part of your curve. Now for the rares. My tier S superstar is Archfiend of the Dross. Now, it might be tempting to use this card as a reason to run more of an oil counter heavy Rakdos and include some cards like Free from Flesh. I don't recommend it, since I've found the game to be over before the 4 oil counters are up. You do want to play around Planar Disruption and Mesmerizing Dose if you find yourself against white or blue. And the card I take a little more highly if I pack 1 pick 1, this is Annihilating Glare. Usually you have better removal, but it's a decent backup plan if you end up needing to sacrifice Archfiend of the Dross to get it off of the board. Archfiend of the Dross is a beast in every black archetype, but its best archetype is Rakdos. Since I don't recommend leaning into the oil synergies, you may be asking yourself, why Rakdos then? And it's because it pings for 2 every time you trade or remove an opponent's creature with removal. It's wonderful. I highly recommend it. My next tier S Rakdos superstar is Urabrask's Forge. I had originally put Izzet as the best archetype for this card because of being able to proliferate the oil to ramp to bigger X1 haste tramplers, but I've finally settled on Rakdos as its best archetype. Your removal slows the game down enough that you can get additional payoffs. Your removal slows the game down enough so that you don't have to race with this card as much, and it does still give you that inevitability. And you also get additional payoffs if you have Charforger in play. You can also cast cards like Annihilating Glare and sacrifice the token. So, like Archfiend of the Dross, you might want to take Annihilating Glare a little bit more highly if you open this up pack 1, pick 1. As is tradition, I'm going to skip some rares that are better in other archetypes. Dragonwing Glider is a tier 1 rare in Rakdos, but it is a tier 1 rare in every red archetype. Koth, Fire of Resistance, like Urabrask's Forge, is also a card I had originally speculated was best in Izzet because I wanted to proliferate to the emblem. After playing him in multiple events, I've settled on Rakdos as his best archetype. Usually you end up using the -3 ability for removal, and then work your way back up to the emblem, or use it as multiple instances of removal. I do end up being mostly red in Rakdos, so getting to the emblem is game over, and I must admit it is a satisfying way to win the game. Now all the way down to my tier 3 rares, Vron, Executioner, Thane. This card is usually little more than a black grizzly bear, but in Rakdos it can really shine. Being able to drain your opponent for 2 every time you trade off a creature is great, and the gaining 2 life can be very crucial when racing your opponent. It's not quite at the power level required for me to force an archetype if I open it up pack 1, pick 1, but it is a great pickup if it happens to line up. I've also noticed that outside of the rare drafters on Arena, this card tends to go pretty late during in-pod drafting. Or maybe my playgroup just really doesn't like black. My last tier 3 rare worth a mention is Black Sun's Twilight. I think its best archetype is Golgari, since green gives you some more interesting top end to aim to reanimate. But its second best archetype is Rakdos. First, its removal, which Rakdos cares the most about, and Testament Bearer is a pretty decent target to reanimate and makes this card a quasi 3-for-1. Now for the mythics. I mentioned in my guide to Orsov that Sheoldred the Apocalypse, aka Shelly, is best in Rakdos, and I stand behind that claim. Since you are attacking every turn and accepting trades to keep the board state small for your edicts, it's not uncommon for your opponent's life total to be on the lower side by turn 4 or 5. Clearly, this is the dream reanimation target for Black Sun's Twilight, but the real payoff is being able to just sit back and watch your opponent's life total dwindle every time they draw a card. She's tier S in every black archetype, but in Rakdos, you can also afford to attack with her when the board state is small, and is a great way to bait your opponent into getting 2-for-1 by your excellent removal. Last but not least, we have Vraska, Betrayal's Sting. Another card that is best in Golgari. The dream is to have Vorinclex in play to immediately ultimate and give your opponent 18 poison counters, a trick probably best saved for Constructed, but possible in theory. I think Rakdos is her second best archetype, followed shortly by Dimir because of the Toxic Proliferate. In Rakdos, she plays similar to Koth as a planeswalker that can hit for multiple rounds of removal. The ability to draw a card can also be important later in the game, since trading 1-for-1 tends to lead to top decking a fair amount of the time. Thank you for enjoying my simple guide to Rakdos, and thank you for taking a moment to hit like and subscribe. I appreciate it. Next week will be a no rares required double feature, since we have 2 archetypes left, Golgari and Celestia. Before I need to start preparing my overview guide for the release of March of the Machines, which is coming to Arena on April 18th. Thank you all so much for the support, and I will see you next week.